The fog rolled in thick, like a living thing, as Michael Bennett drove his old Jeep along the winding mountain road. The headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the dense trees that loomed on either side. He glanced nervously at the dashboard. They were getting close now. His maps had shown him this path a dozen times, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer desolation that seemed to be closing in. Merrow Creek was no longer a name on any modern map. Once, it had been a thriving town, a community built on agriculture, trade, and industry. But now it was nothing more than a forgotten relic, an afterthought in history. Michael had come to uncover its truth. He'd heard the whispers. Tales from his grandmother about strange occurrences and unsolved disappearances. People had left the town overnight, as if something had forced them away. The police had never found any trace of what happened. A curse, his grandmother had said. And now, all these years later, Michael was obsessed. He had to know what happened. He wasn't alone. Laura, his assistant, sat beside him, her face pale, eyes wide as she stared out the window into the thick fog. She had always been more cautious, more skeptical, but even she couldn't deny the pull of Merrow Creek's mystery. "I don't like it, Michael," Laura said, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's something wrong with this place. We should turn back." Michael shot her a reassuring smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're close. We came all this way for a reason, Laura. We need to understand what happened here." The road became rougher, the trees growing twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers in the mist. The further they went, the more the oppressive silence weighed down on them. No birds, no sounds of life, nothing. Just the howl of the wind. Minutes later, they saw it. A sign that barely stood upright, its paint faded and peeling. "Welcome to Merrow Creek." A chill crept up Michael's spine. Michael slowed the Jeep as they entered the heart of the town. Merrow Creek stretched out before them like a broken memory, decaying houses, shattered windows, and streets overgrown with weeds. The air was thick with stillness, as though time had stopped here, suspended in some eternal void. "Michael, this place, it feels dead," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "It doesn't feel like a town at all. More like a graveyard." Michael didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the church that loomed at the center of the town square. Its tall spire was crooked, leaning toward the earth as though it were a warning to anyone who dared approach. The doors were ajar, a dark abyss beyond. He felt a pull toward it, a magnetic force he couldn't explain. "This is where it all started," he muttered, more to himself than to Laura. "The disappearances. The strange occurrences. Everything began here, in that church." Laura hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously between the church and the car. "We don't know what we're walking into. We could be making a huge mistake." Michael got out of the Jeep, the creak of the door startling in the oppressive silence. "We've come this far," he said, forcing himself to sound confident. "We're not turning back now." The ground beneath their feet was soft and wet, as though the town had absorbed all the rain in the world, leaving it damp and cold. They walked toward the church, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Michael's breath came out in small puffs of mist, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. As they reached the church's entrance, Michael paused. He could feel something, an energy, a presence, radiating from the dark interior. It was as if the building was alive, waiting for them. The doors creaked open on their own, the ancient hinges groaning in protest. "After you," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael stepped inside, and the air hit him like a punch. It was thick with dust, stale air, and the unmistakable scent of mildew. The interior was worse than he had imagined, pews overturned, shattered glass from a broken stained glass window scattered across the floor, and the remnants of what looked like long-abandoned rituals etched into the walls. Strange symbols, crude and unsettling, had been scratched into the stone. "Jesus," Laura breathed, looking around at the destruction. What happened here? Michael's flashlight swept over the walls, illuminating the strange markings and symbols. Some looked like old runes, while others resembled twisted, nightmarish faces, grotesque, almost animalistic in form. He moved closer to one symbol, his hand trembling slightly as he traced its shape in the air with the beam of his light. "What is this?" Laura asked, her voice shaky, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "This isn't just some old church, this place feels wrong." Michael didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on a set of words scrawled across the altar, written in a jagged, hasty hand. They were in a language he didn't recognize, but the sense of urgency in the markings made his skin crawl. A chill crept down his spine, despite the heat of the room. "Do you feel that?" Laura whispered. "It's like, the air is heavy here. Like it's pressing down on us." Before Michael could respond, a low hum began to vibrate beneath their feet. At first, it was barely noticeable, like the faint buzz of a faraway insect. But then it grew, steadily increasing in volume and intensity, until the very walls of the church seemed to tremble with it. "Do you hear that?" Michael asked, turning toward Laura. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know what that is," she said, voice quivering. "But it's getting closer." The sound was growing louder, more oppressive, filling the entire church. It wasn't a hum anymore, it was a deep, resonant drone, like something beneath the earth itself was waking up. Michael's heart raced, his instincts screaming at him to turn and leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Something was drawing him deeper into the church. Suddenly, the hum stopped. And then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant murmur, too soft to understand. But as the seconds passed, they grew louder, clearer. They weren't human voices, at least, not in any way Michael could recognize. The words were distorted, guttural, like they were coming from deep within the earth, from something not of this world. "Leave," a voice hissed from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here." Laura grabbed Michael's arm, her grip tight. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the church doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Michael's heart skipped a beat. They were trapped. A figure appeared in the doorway at the far end of the church. It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin. Its limbs seemed to bend at unnatural angles, and its head was tilted at an odd, grotesque angle as it slowly moved toward them. Michael's breath caught in his throat. What is that?" The creature didn't respond. It simply moved closer, its elongated fingers brushing against the walls as it drew nearer, as though the church itself was guiding it forward. "We need to get out of here," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "This place, it's not just haunted. It's alive." The creature's eyes locked onto them, its gaze cold, empty, like two pits of endless darkness. Michael's pulse raced as he backed away from the figure. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The creature's eyes, black, fathomless voids, seemed to hold him in place, as if they were pulling him towards something far darker than mere terror. Its limbs, impossibly long and spindly, crept across the church's floor with a disjointed grace, the sound of its movements a sickening scrape. Laura's grip tightened on Michael's arm, her fingers trembling. "We can't stay here," she gasped, her voice breaking. "We need to get out. Now." But as she pulled at his arm, Michael felt a cold chill sweep over him, an unnatural frost that sank deep into his bones. The air was growing thicker, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere had been tainted by something ancient and malevolent. The walls of the church seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic throb, as if breathing. The creature's head tilted at an even more grotesque angle, its long neck creaking like the bending of an old tree. Slowly, it spoke, its voice not coming from its mouth, but from the very walls themselves, a deep, guttural growl that sent a shiver through Michael's spine. "You shouldn't have come," the creature rasped. Its voice was like the sound of breaking glass, sharp, jagged, and unbearable. "This place is mine. And now, so are you." Michael's heart hammered in his chest. There was no escape, not through the doors, not through the windows. The only way out was through the creature, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that it would never let them go. But before the creature could move again, something unexpected happened. The hum from earlier returned, louder now, but this time it wasn't a disembodied sound, it was coming from the altar. Michael's eyes darted toward the source of the noise. The markings on the altar, the ones he had seen earlier, were glowing faintly, their lines shifting and writhing as if alive. "No. No, no, no." Laura gasped, her voice rising in panic. "What is happening?" Suddenly, the church began to shake. The floor beneath them trembled, and dust fell from the ceiling in thick, choking clouds. The very foundation of the building seemed to groan, as though something below was stirring, something old and powerful, waiting to be unleashed. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, its head snapping back violently, as if it were in pain. For the first time, it seemed vulnerable, its limbs twitching erratically, its grip on reality starting to slip. It turned toward the altar, as though it could sense the disturbance beneath the ground. "What the hell is going on?" Michael muttered, backing away as the shaking intensified. Then, the floor gave way. With a deafening crash, the ground beneath the altar buckled, splitting wide open. A dark, gaping chasm yawned beneath them, swallowing the altar whole. The church groaned as the very walls seemed to crack, splintering apart, their ancient stones crumbling to dust. But that wasn't the worst of it. From the depths of the chasm came a sound, an awful, guttural roar that reverberated through Michael's chest. It was a sound that spoke of hunger, ancient hunger, primal and endless. And then, something began to rise from the black abyss below. Something enormous. The air grew thick, suffocating, as Michael stumbled backward, trying to pull Laura away from the growing chasm. The creature's screeches were now joined by the thunderous roar coming from the abyss below. It was a low, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very foundation of the church, reverberating in Michael's chest like the beat of a colossal heart. From the depths of the dark hole, something massive began to emerge. At first, it was a shadow, large, undulating, and incomprehensible in its shape. But as the creature rose higher, Michael could make out the outline of something ancient and monstrous, its form too vast for the walls of the church to contain. "What the hell is that?" Laura whispered in horror, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of noise. The thing that emerged from the chasm was indescribable. Its size alone was enough to make Michael's blood run cold, an endless, black mass, oozing a thick, inky substance that dripped like tar. It had no clear shape, but it was alive, somehow, impossibly alive. Its surface squirmed, writhing in ways that defied logic, and in the dim light, Michael could see countless eyes, too many eyes, appearing on its surface, blinking in unison, following their every move. The pulsating mass was growing, expanding, its tar-like tendrils stretching toward them. Michael could feel it, this thing wasn't just alive, it was aware. It knew they were here. And it wasn't finished with them yet. In a panic, Laura shoved him toward the door. She was screaming now, her voice cracking, but her words were lost to the roar of the thing as it continued to grow. She pulled Michael outside, into the cold night air, but the fog that had once been comforting now seemed suffocating. The streets of Merrow Creek, once eerily silent, were now filled with an unnatural hum. The ground beneath their feet began to crack, and the sound of creaking metal echoed from the town's abandoned structures. The town itself seemed to be responding to the awakening of the ancient creature beneath it, shifting, warping, as if the very earth was reacting to the disturbance. Michael turned back toward the church, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The church was no longer just a building. It was alive. The walls of the church were warping, the steeple groaning as if it were stretching toward the sky, trying to reach the stars or the heavens themselves. The thing from the chasm was still rising, but it was no longer confined to the church. It was consuming everything, the town, the very land beneath them. The air outside was suffocating. Michael and Laura ran down the overgrown streets, the fog pressing in on them from all sides, thick as a living thing. Michael's mind raced, each step felt like an eternity, each breath like fire in his chest. He could hear the walls of Merrow Creek groan, the earth itself shifting as the creature, whatever it was, continued to rise from its prison. Behind them, the town seemed to be disintegrating. The buildings that had once stood silent and abandoned were now twisting, warping, like they were being slowly consumed by the dark force below. The street lamps flickered erratically, their light now dim and sickly. It was as if Merrow Creek itself was being swallowed, piece by piece, by the ancient evil that had been unleashed. "Michael!" Laura cried, her voice breaking. "We need to get out of here. We need to leave before it's too late." He could barely hear her over the sound of the ground beneath their feet cracking, the deep, thunderous rumble coming from the earth as the creature continued to grow. It was no longer just a single entity. It was spreading, into the land, into the town, into them. Michael could feel it, deep inside his bones. It was pulling at them, trying to drag them back. His thoughts flashed to the maps he had studied, to the legends his grandmother had told him. The town was built on a burial ground. An ancient evil had been sealed beneath the earth by the first settlers, and it had waited, patient and silent, for centuries. The disappearances, the curse, everything had led to this moment. Michael and Laura were never supposed to uncover the truth. They had woken something that was never meant to be awakened. "We can't escape it," Michael shouted, his voice raw with fear. "It's everywhere. The whole town, it's part of it now." They stumbled toward the edge of town, but the ground beneath their feet began to tremble harder, shaking violently. Michael felt the earth splitting beneath him, cracks opening wide like jaws, as if the land itself wanted to devour them. Then, suddenly, it was upon them. A massive tendril shot out from the ground, wrapping around Michael's legs with inhuman strength. He gasped, the air knocked out of him as he was yanked off his feet and dragged toward the opening in the earth. Laura screamed, trying to reach him, but another tendril shot out, wrapping around her waist and pulling her into the darkness. "Laura!" Michael cried out, his voice hoarse. He reached for her, but his vision blurred as the world around him spun, the ground shifting under him as if the very town were collapsing in on itself. The last thing he saw was the creature, its grotesque, squirming form, eyes blinking on every surface, its tendrils stretching toward him as he was pulled into the depths. His body was consumed by the tar-like substance, dragging him under. And then there was nothing.